for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. Thanks a lot for the introduction. I am Sanjukta from the Indian Statistical Institute, and we have heard much about the Metoposaurid, the histology of the Metoposaurid, the Polish Metoposaurid, and now welcome everyone to the traveling Metoposaurid. This diagram shows the TEMNOSPONDYLS families present in India, and show the TEMNOSPONDYLS families available in India, and I'm just showing the position of the Metoposaurid here. And it is globally present Metoposaurid in North America, Morocco, Poland, Germany, and India. And the position or its presence in India is quite unique. This map shows the global position in the Pangea about the Metoposaurid. And here you can see mainly the Metoposaurid clusters here, and the Indian position is quite away. It's away from the main cluster of the Metoposaurid. This is the global paleo position, paleo distribution of the Metoposaurid available, and I'll try to show the position of the lacrimal with respect to the orbit, that being one of the most discussed parameters. And this seems to be quite a variable parameter in all the species shown here. Now coming to the taxonomic schemes of the Metoposaurid that have been attempted till date, people seem to be much interested there. Colbert and Imbrie tried to split the Metoposaurid into primarily two categories, one where the lacrimal enters into the orbit margin, and the other where the lacrimal doesn't enter into the orbit margin. The species where the lacrimal does not enter into the orbit margin were the European forms. Colbert suggested them to be the European forms, and the species where the lacrimal enters or intrudes into the orbit margin, that was the predominantly North American forms. However, later workers like Chaudhary, Dutuit, they suggested this parameter, the relationship of the lacrimal and orbit, to be a very variable parameter, and Chaudhary clubbed all the genus of the Metoposaurid into one symbol, naming them and keeping them to be Metoposaurid. However, people were really very enthusiastic to split the Metoposaurid once again, and Hunt in 1993 took the lacrimal with the relation of the orbits to be an important parameter, and the Metoposaurid genus name was kept valid only for the European species, where the lacrimal does not enter into the orbit margin according to Hunt, and Buettneria, the generic name, was assigned to the North American species where the lacrimal is supposed to enter into the orbit margin. As you listening to it, everybody can well understand what a great confusion it might create. Later, Sanjukta tried to erect a new combination and naming it Buettneria malariensis, taking into account the huge geographical isolation of the Indian Metoposaurids much away from the main cluster. However, that name was in question also because Buettneria came to be a junior synonym, and so the name should have been Coscinodont malariensis. However, later, Coscinodont was suggested to be preoccupied, and Sulet in 2007 showed that, as previous to Chaudhary, Dutuit all have suggested, the position of the lacrimal with respect to the orbit was a real variable parameter, because several North American forms where the lacrimal was supposed to enter into the orbit margin showed specimens where the lacrimal did not intrude the orbit margin, and several European forms where the lacrimal is not supposed to enter the orbit margin had the lacrimals well intruded into the orbit margin, including Metoposaurid diagnosticus. Thus, the very important Indian specimen with its unique position was in a severe crisis, losing its name altogether. Taking into account all the confusion, various previous workers tried to use basic morphometric steps, and as you can see, Colbert and Imbrie used a reduced axis, major axis plot, taking into account the skull length and the width and the end orbital length and the post-orbital length of the North American forms Later we have tried to superimpose the black one, that is the Indian form, on the same plot, and the results show that the Indian forms shows overlap. That means these two characters are also variable. They show quite a bit of overlap. Though there are uniqueness, but that is too little. The overlap is quite great. Now coming to the Colbert's Emery second plot, that is also with the skull length and width, and with the ale and the PL, that is antorbital to the post-orbital length. These 4 specimens show the 4 extreme parameters available, and the red ones, the Indian forms, have been superimposed on the North American plots of Colbert and Emery. Here also, the Indian forms show quite similarity with the North American form. That was what it was suggested previously. Later, as a previous work, Sanjukta attempted factor analysis of the Metoposaurid with the Indian forms. The circled ones are Indian forms, and here you can see the Indian forms in some parts show overlap or similarities with the North American form. However, they are quite separated also. There is a uniqueness. Now, the Indian scenario. The Indian position is in the paleo latitudes, like 30 degrees north to 30 degrees south, and the Indian Metoposaur is a Gondwana element, and they were predominantly Laurentian fauna known to localities restricted between 0 to 30 degrees north. However, the India was a part of the Gondwana, and the Indian Metoposaurs were found within latitudes noticeably 0 to 30 degrees south in the lower Triassic Malary Formation. Another important feature which is really noticeable is that the Laurentian Metoposaurs and the Gondwana Chigutosaurs are both present in the late Triassic of India. The Indian fauna has therefore long been known for its non-endemic nature, and that is quite to be taken into account. Now coming to the crisis of the Indian form or the problem that lies. First, the problematic taxonomy. The taxon doesn't have a name yet, and it needs to be assigned a name because it is really unique in its geographical position, quite isolated from the main cluster of the Metoposaurids, and there are several unique parameters which I am going to show next. I said the second is the strategic geographical position away from the main cluster. The third is the previous multivariate analysis which shows overlap, and the uniqueness is not really quite clear from the previous analysis. And the fourth, I have therefore tried to sort them out using next shape analysis. These are the morphospace plots which I have plotted using the modern morphometrics in R, and this is the convex hull. This is taking the extremity of the shape, and as you can all see, the main shapes are in a cluster. Not much quite uniqueness or difference in the skull width and skull length parameters. Only the Moroccan form shows a quite difference. Others are more or less clustered and overlap, all belonging to the same area. Coming to the next, the morphospace based on the shape of the lacrimals. Here, this is the Indian form. The Indian form noticeably was supposed to show a good affinity with the North American form, but here it is the first showing quite a difference, quite a distance with the North American form, and it is more clubbed with the European form, these two other European forms. Coming to the next, that is the morphospace based on the shape of the orbits. Here also this is the Indian part. This is North American forms, these are the European forms, and the Indian form is quite separated from the North American forms as well as from the Indian forms. This is the much discussed topic, the position of the lacrimal entering into the orbit margin, that is its relation with the orbit margin. Here, as we can all see, there are some specimens where the lacrimal widely intrudes the orbit margin. Somewhere the thickness of the lacrimal entering into the orbit margin varies. Somewhere it just touches the orbit margin, and there are some specimens where the lacrimal does not intrude the orbit margin at all. And here we can see India is quite widely separated and doesn't show any overlap with either the North American or the European forms, based on the shapes only. This is the shape of the parietals. This is quite unique to the Indian form. As we can see, all the North American, the European and all the forms show wide amount of overlap, suggesting that the shape of the parietals are not really very much accounted or very much unique for the European or the North American forms. However, it is to be noted that the Indian form shows a very little overlap. Major part of the Indian form is non-overlapping, making the Indian specimens unique based on the shape of their parietals. So coming to summarizing the context of the Indian specimens, they are variable in their shapes, both on the skull outlines and the bone outlines. However, there are overlaps when we consider single outline of shapes. There is uniqueness in the parietal shape in the Indian metaposaur. However, taking into account all the previous shape analysis that I have tried to show, it is the combination that makes each and every form unique in its respect. In the case of the Indian form, the shape of the orbits, the shape of the parietals, and the others all taken together, the combination of the characters, including the geographical isolation, the geographical position of the India makes it quite unique. Most of my parameters were thus numerical parameters. This is the multivariate cluster analysis where the Indian taxon forms here. This is the main cluster of the Metoposaurids. This is Metoposaurus diagnosticus, European form, and Howardensis Buettneri, North American forms, and this is the Indian taxon, which here also shows to be quite separated from the main cluster of the Metoposaurids, appearing to be a sister taxon to them. So this is partly a short combination of the characters that I have used to identify the Indian forms, that is large and comparatively closely spaced near compared to its European, North American counterparts. Lateral lines that never form a loop behind the orbits. Postparietals, though the shape varies quite a bit, are comparatively smaller than the other Metoposaurids. The angle of widening of the parietals is smaller compared to the others, and comparatively larger area of rounded or hexagonal depression of the interclavicles that is not really included in this part of the study. So, the Indian taxon needs some name. It needs to be named something. This is the suggested name. This is Panthosaurus malariensis. The generic name Panthosaurus is derived from the Sanskrit word pantho. In Sanskrit, this means a distant traveler through time, because as I have already said, the Indian form is not really endemic to India. It is non-endemic to India, and there is a possibility that due to the fact that the circumtachyon shoreline was short and very cryptic during the Triassic, the Metoposaurids could have come along the shoreline, that they could have swum across the shoreline. On the other hand, the Metoposaurids, the pictures we have seen or their muscle structure all suggest perhaps that they were really sluggish animals. So it would have been rather strenuous for them to travel much. So it is possible that the circumtachyon shoreline was short and cryptic and they easily swam across to India. This is the image of Panthosaurus malariensis for my study. So you can see the space between the nerves, the postparietals.